Hello, everybody. We are just getting started with the meeting, and if you can bear with us, we're just going to wait for a few, just give an extra minute or two for folks to trickle in, and then we will kick off the event. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone here, the several hundred people that we have joining us on Zoom, as well as Facebook, live on Facebook. Welcome to Against Imperialist War, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and the US. My name is Lee Wengraf. I'm based in New York City, and I'm a member of Tempest and Internationalism from Below, and we're so appreciative to have our panelists here today to discuss this incredibly urgent moment, a brutal imperial invasion of Ukraine by Russia that has unleashed death and destruction and deepened inter-imperial conflict in Europe and globally. And as we build solidarity with the courageous resistance in Ukraine, as well as protesters across Russia, we felt it critical for the left to come together and discuss the range of questions on the war's origins and how to best respond. So again, we're so glad to have all of you here today. This event is sponsored by the Tempest Collective, and you can find us online at tempestmag.org, and I will post more information about that during the meeting. This event is also endorsed by the following organizations and publications: Against the Current, Anti-Capitalist Resistance, Haymarket Books, Internationalism from Below, Madison Area DSA, Marks 21 US, Midnight Sun, New Politics, Rampant, Solidarity, and Spectre. So we have 5 speakers today who I will introduce each in turn, but just to give people a quick lay of the land for the meeting, each panelist is going to take about 10 minutes to give opening comments, and then following up with a couple of minutes apiece for a quick second round before we turn it over to the audience for questions and comments. And if you'd like to introduce either of those, just use the Q&A feature on Zoom and try to get, just so that we can try and get as many people in and participate as possible, please aim to keep the comments, concise as possible. Please note that we have a very large number of people joining us today, so we're not going to be able, unfortunately, to get to everyone, but thanks in advance for your understanding on that. So, without further ado, we're going to open this up to the first of our 5 speakers. The first speaker is going to be Gilbert Achcar. Gilbert is a professor at SOAS, University of London, and the author of The People Want, a radical exploration of the Arab Spring, with a new edition coming in September, and The New Cold War, Chronicle of a Confrontation Foretold, which is forthcoming. So Gilbert, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, and many thanks to the organizers for organizing this important opportunity to exchange ideas about the very tragic and very important events that are going on presently. So since I'm speaking first, I think best is to put what is happening in historical perspective. And I think, of course, the starting point is the end of the previous Cold War, the Cold War, as it was called, which goes back to 1991, basically, or 1990, depending on which event is regarded more important, from 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to 1990, the unification of Germany, to the end of 91, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and everything that went along with the Soviet Union, like before that, the Warsaw Pact and the rest. So that of course opened a completely new phase in international relations. And the world entered at that moment into what was called by a famous formula, a famous phrase, the unipolar moment, where the United States was the only superpower left in the ring, left standing in the ring. The United States had overwhelming supremacy over everybody else. It had offered a live demonstration of its destructive capabilities in Iraq, over Iraq in early 91, the first of the two US wars on Iraq under Bush Senior. And so you had this moment of triumph of the United States. And that went along with a very clear conscience that we find in the documents of that time, speaking of shaping the world. I mean, the United States was indeed in a position to shape the configuration of the world order that was to come as a result of this huge change. And of course, there were debates, as you may imagine, a huge debate actually in Washington, not only Washington, generally in the United States, very, very intensive debates in the how to say, in the think tanks of US foreign policy, in the political class in the United States, as it is called, and that is, I mean, basically a debate within the ruling class itself, up to the higher echelon in the U.S. government, and the cabinet of Bill Clinton, the first mandate. You had this debate about what to do, how to deal with post-communist or post-Stalinist, if you want, or post-Soviet Russia, and so basically the two options where one was to integrate Russia within this global order, within the Western order, if you want, along with economic aid, the formula Marshall Plan, the same as the economic help given by the United States to Europe, Western Europe, after the war of the Second World War. So economic aid, integration, and therefore keeping NATO as it is, if not dissolving NATO, but certainly not enlarging NATO. And the other option was, well, just the contrary of what I just mentioned. The enlargement of NATO with a position regarding Russia as a potential, even though Russia was very much diminished compared to what the Soviet Union, but regarding Russia as a potential rival of the United States. This went along with very harsh economic policies inflicted upon the Russian population, with the collusion, of course, of the Russian, those who became the oligarchs and all that, who made huge profits over this. And the result has been indeed creating the present condition and creating a situation that led to the rise of Vladimir Putin in Russia. Vladimir Putin is very much a product of this situation that has been, to a large extent, created by US and Western decisions in the dealing with Russia. And that's what we have. Now, this creates quite a new or renewed situation, in the sense that we are in a way back to 1914, in the sense of what you have is a clash between imperialist powers, because present-day Russia, whatever debates one could have about the Soviet Union, there is no debate possible about, I think, the imperialist character of present-day Russia, with, on top of that, a very vicious capitalist reactionary government, as we can see. I mean, if the anti-war movement in the United States were to be treated in the way the Russian anti-war movement is, you can imagine how it would be. So that's where we are. And for the left, for the international left, and with this, for the international left, of course, there has been a lot of disarray, a lot of confusion with that. With part of that left keeping, reactions which, I mean, if I were to make a little joke about it, but I would say, I mean, instead of Ulyanov, which is Lenin, it is Pavlov that is guiding another Russian these attitudes. And I mean by that, you have these knee-jerk reactions, which regarded every enemy of the US government as something that should be supported. Now, this kind of attitude we have seen, Syria was an important moment of that kind of attitude, with part of the left supporting, in fact, this terrible destructive war that the Russian imperialism launched in Syria in support of one of the worst dictatorships in the world. But now today, this whole range of Pavlovian part of the left is in deep confusion. Some of them carry on supporting Russia, but I think many have now realized that Russia is also an imperialist state, and an ugly imperialist state at that. This is a very ugly invasion. For me, coming from the Middle East, it's nothing new. I've seen that in Syria, and Syria has had a huge tragedy, even until now, larger than what is unfolding now in Ukraine. So that's, I think, what I would say as a starting comment on that.
Thank you so much, Gilbert, for those really helpful remarks. So now we're going to turn to our next speaker. We're very excited to have Ilya Budraitskis with us. He's a Moscow-based historian and political writer. He's also the author of Dissident Among Dissidents, Ideology, Politics, and the Left in Post-Soviet Russia. And he is a member of the editorial board of Moscow Art Magazine, OpenLeft.ru, and Left East. Ilya, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for this very important meeting. And I want to start with what happened not the decade ago, not 30 years ago, and I think it was very correctly described by Gilbert. But I want to talk a bit what we had in Russia during the last 2 weeks, the weeks after the start of this criminal, bloody war in Ukraine. So, in fact, when the war was started in the early morning of 24th of February, no one in Russia was really prepared for such an event and for such consequences of this event. For now, it is quite clear that the army, the Russian army, was not prepared for such a level of resistance, for such great protest against any any presence of Russia politically and militarily in Ukraine. The political machinery of Putin's regime was not prepared for such challenge, for the economic sanctions, for such a big cost of the invasion to Ukraine, and for, of course, a huge task of the state propaganda to explain what is going on in Ukraine to the Russian society. And of course, the Russian society was not was not prepared at all for what happened. And even for now, I think, unfortunately, the majority of the Russian society still doesn't realize what is going on. In fact, we have, after these 2 weeks of war, not a military defeat of the Russian army yet, but we have already the political defeat of the Russian, let's say, project in Ukraine, which, according to the plans of the Russian president, mean the rapid capitulation of Ukrainian army, the, let's say, disappearance of Ukrainian authorities, and peaceful, quick occupation of the country by the Russian troops. That didn't happen, and it's even now hard to imagine what could be the political victory of Russia in Ukraine, how it could look like the neutral Ukraine, the friendly Ukraine, after so many deaths, so many destructions, so many military crimes already made, not just against the Ukrainian army, but against the Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian peaceful population. In Russian society, we had during these 2 weeks a rapid change of the atmosphere. So if, let's say, just a month ago, we still had let's say, authoritarian state with some small space for the different opinion, for some alternative media, of course, who were already ghettoized, but they existed. So for now, we are moving forward to the real open dictatorship. So during these 2 weeks, all the existed alternative media were destroyed. All the social media which could provide some alternative information, they're destroying or banning right now. So, for example, today it's the last day of the Facebook presence in Russia and Instagram as well. Also, a number of new laws were adopted by Russian parliament, by the pro-war majority of the Russian parliament. So, for example, for now, for so-called disinformation about the actions of the Russian army, you could be imprisoned up to 15 years. And for example, if you just call this military peacekeeping operation of the Russian army in Ukraine as war or as invasion. So that is already distribution of the misinformation. In fact, during this time, the official information, the TV propaganda create a totally different, let's say, alternative reality for the most of Russians. The reality which is totally different from those images that we have from the media of the rest of the world. There is no bombings of Kiev, there is no bombings of Kharkiv on Russian media. There are just talks about the liberation of Donbass, of this region of the East Ukraine, where you have this semi-people's republics. And this propaganda, the main idea of this propaganda, that this peacekeeping operation will end it soon. And this is the main idea, which still we still keep in some passive condition of passive support of the government, of the actions of the Russian government for the most of the Russian population. So let's say that most of people who could say that they support the actions of the Russian government in Ukraine, they believe that it will end up in some week and everything will be the same as it was just before this war was started. So it's not clear how it will work in some coming weeks, when it will be more and more clear that it's not a successful victorious operation, but it's a full-bloody war with a lot of deaths also among the Russian soldiers. Also, the effect of the sanctions is really huge. It's really destructive for the Russian economy, but the most of population, they still doesn't recognize the scale of this effect, and that gives the opportunity for propaganda also to support this idea that this is just a temporary problems that will be overcome quite soon. In fact, in number of months, let's say in some 3-4 months, it became clear that the millions of Russians will be the victims of these sanctions, the victims of unemployment, of poverty. And basically the sanctions will target especially two big groups of population, the people in the big cities who were employed in smaller business, in trade, in kind of creative industries and so on. And the second group is the traditional working class in so-called mono cities, mono towns, in the huge factory, huge enterprises, which situated in the small towns where the most of the population actually are working on these enterprises. So for now, we can say that the anti-war movement is still very limited. And of course, these people who even today came to the streets of Moscow, of St. Petersburg, and other Russian cities to protest, they're very brave people, and their protest is extremely important, but unfortunately is still isolated from the most of Russian society. Of course, the answer to this protest is already quite brutal, and I think that probably it will be much more brutal in the coming weeks. So the last thing I want to say that we need solidarity, international solidarity with the anti-war movement in Russia. We need the international solidarity with people of Ukraine who are suffering because of this bloody war, and with all the Pavlovian, as it was pointed by Gilbert, criticism to its own imperialism, the Western left should not bring any excuses for the reactionary, bloody, and criminal dictatorship of Vladimir Putin in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, comrade. That was really, really important words. And before I turn to the next speaker, who is going to be Volodymyr Ishchenko, I just want to let people know that we have on this meeting over 350 people, which is really amazing, exciting, and people are weighing in the chat from all over the world, from Palestine, Nigeria, from all over Europe, and so on. So we're really just so excited to see all of you here. So now, without further ado, turn it over to, well, I want to introduce Volodymyr. Volodymyr Ishchenko is a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies, Free Universität Berlin, and he has written for The Guardian, Jacobin, and Truthout, and is working on a book entitled The Maidan Uprising, Mobilization, Radicalization, and Revolution in Ukraine, 2013 to 2014. Thank you so much. Welcome, Volodymyr.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting discussion. Perhaps I'll share my thoughts on on which consequences this war might have, not simply for Ukraine, but I believe for the whole post-Soviet space. And I think that the war starts the end of what we knew as so-called post-Soviet condition. So it's gonna end either by dismantling the post-Soviet space completely, or by finally determining the contours and the directions of development that the post-Soviet elites might take, and towards more stable political, economic, and ideological structures. That could be also challenged by much more radical and much more transformative revolution in the future that we've seen before in the post-Soviet countries. So what used to be actually the post-Soviet space, it could not be defined in any other way as simply by this prefix post. So it's simply something that replaced Soviet state socialism, or whatever you would call it, that regime that existed in the Soviet Union. But what exactly replaced it, that was actually something undefinable, because one line of debate is that the post-Soviet countries were moving towards, so basically they were lagging behind the Central European Union that joined EU, that joined NATO, and through the postponed 1999 movements, through the multiple and accelerating Maidan revolutions in Ukraine, for example, we've seen 3 of them during the life of just one generation, but not just in Ukraine, in Georgia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, very recently uprisings in Belarus, in Kazakhstan. So there were many of them that were accelerated, but at the same time, they were not actually bringing any revolutionary changes in any meaningful sense of the word. A faction of elite was replacing the faction of the same elite and exploiting the revolutionary legitimacy for quite unpopular interests and quite unpopular political agendas. And the list, and actually in Ukrainian case, it was not only ironically, but also at this moment, we understand it very tragically, those revolutions were bringing to the real prospects of EU and NATO to the minimal scale. So basically, to bringing no closer. And what was the actual process that was developing in the post-Soviet countries? It was, as we, with my colleague, Russian sociologist Oleg Zhuravlev, defined as a perpetual crisis of hegemony, or the crisis of political representation, that post-Soviet revolutions were only reproducing and at the same time escalating and intensifying. So from the very start, the post-Soviet elites who amassed their fortunes in the process of rapid and arbitrary privatization of the state property in the 1990s lacked any broadly acceptable ideological, religious, or traditional justification, and have struggled to secure broad legitimacy of their rule. And the leaders like Putin, who we analyze as a variety of Caesarism or Bonapartism within Marxist or Gramscian tradition, they raised to power, serving a very important function for this post-Soviet elite. They ensured their assets and the opportunities for rent-seeking, and at the same time, they stopped the self-damaging centrifugal processes via coercion of some factions of this post-Soviet elites and balancing the interests of the others. And they also could draw on some popular legitimacy from restoring stability in the midst of the post-Soviet chaotic collapse. But the source of that legitimacy was simply preventing the slide into even more disaster, but not any kind of developmental project to lead the way out from the huge gray zone of stagnation and degradation that appeared after the Soviet collapse. And the leaders like Putin, they were simply conserved, but not resolved the post-Soviet crisis. And we've just seen recently that so seemingly strong and consolidated authoritarian regimes in Belarus and Kazakhstan would not be able to survive the recent massive protests without Russia's help, without Russia intervening on to support Lukashenko and to signal support to Kyiv. And basically, we need to understand Putin's invasion of Ukraine as ultimately a way to compensate with brutal violence the fact that the post-Soviet ruling elites have not acquired any power of attraction. And now, basically, any of the realistic outcomes of this war would probably lead to the fundamental economic, political, and ideological transformations in the whole post-Soviet space. So one of the outcomes could be the ultimate breaking up of the post-Soviet space in case the military resistance in Ukraine and the crippling effect of the economic sanctions would lead to Russia's defeat. And it would mean not only the marginalization of some of the ideological narratives about so-called brotherly Slavic people, or the narratives related to the victory in the Second World War, that this narrative has actually survived the Soviet collapse for more than 30 years and used to be still used to have wide appeal, even in Ukraine, despite all these post-Maidan decommunization policies. But nowadays they are evidently marginalizing as a reaction to the Russian invasion. But I think that the humiliation of the defeat in Ukraine would also accelerate the collapse of Putin's regime. It could happen whether via some ultimate Maidan revolution in Russia, which probably is less likely, but more probably through a coup d'etat by a faction of Russian elites who would be trying to get rid of Putin and maybe trying to re-establish relations with the West. I think in both cases, this would be paralleled with some significant violence, and the major outcome would be the ultimate failure of a sovereign center of the capital accumulation in the post-Soviet space. And the elites in the weakened Russia that quite possibly could turn into a huge failed state or even a patchwork of small statelets as an outcome of a civil war. And in other post-Soviet societies, they would likely reorient towards the West or towards China. And the post-Soviet elites would be forced to abandon their competitive advantages in the selective preferences of the state that are better known as corruption. And they would abandon any hint to the sovereigntist aspirations, and in an attempt over kind of like an honorary integration to the elites of the more powerful states. That would also mean probably the reorientation of the politics of the post-Soviet countries, and some of the counter-hegemonic responses that would be now directed towards the hegemonic claims from the West and from the China, and not necessarily those counter-hegemonic responses would be of the progressive nature, because we should also understand that the longer this war would go on, the more casualties Ukrainians would suffer, the more Ukrainian cities would be destroyed, the more Ukrainian state and Ukrainian military institutions would be disintegrating, the more the people like warlords, some radical nationalist groups would be taking the lead in the resistance and in Ukrainian politics, as it actually happened in the Middle East with the coming to forward of the jihadist group. And the other outcome, I'm just 1 minute to end up my thought, that what would happen if Russia would be able to stand against the Ukrainian resistance and against the sanctions, that would not necessarily mean the preservation of Putin's power, but maybe another leader who would still be capable to negotiate something not so much humiliating as maybe one of the outcomes of the war in some alternative scenarios. But that would mean the fundamental changes of the relations between the Russian leader and political elites, and we would see we are already seeing the symptoms of some reshuffling. Some people are losing some power, other people are getting more important. That would probably mean the fundamental changes in the economic order with more mobilizationist, maybe more redistributive economy, because the Russian state would need could not survive in a long period on sheer repression, on sheer dictatorship. They would be forced to start buying the Russian citizens, the subjugated Ukrainians, Belarusians, the people in other post-Soviet countries. And they would also need to give them some more coherent ideological narrative to start explaining finally what for so many Russian soldiers died, what for they killed so many Ukrainians, brothers, Ukrainians. And this would probably lead the Russian elite to, ultimately to finally to articulate a more coherent nationalist imperialist hegemonic project. And in response, we would see, I hope, the rise of a real counter-hegemony, something that would supersede the superficial Maidan revolutions of the past, and that would be capable to lead to the a new model of a social transformative revolution, and probably once more time, our countries would give the whole world the model of a real revolution as it happened 100 years ago in the weakest link of the imperialist chain. Sorry for taking a little bit more time, but that was important to say everything.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we turn now to our next speaker, who is Ho-Fung Hung. Very glad to have you here. He's the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy and Chair of the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of Clash of Empires from Chimerica to the New Cold War, and also the author of City on the Edge, Hong Kong Under Chinese Rule. Ho-Fung, thank you so much for joining us. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this very timely and also very saddening topics and panel discussion on this topic. And of course, that right now, one factor that might shape how the situation develop would be the position of China and China with US relation and China-Russia relation. And we just read the news that the National Security Advisor of the US, Jake Sullivan, is going to meet with China top diplomat Yang Jieqi and in Rome Monday. And there's some fantasy or expectation that China might be even the mediator to bring a truce or some agreement. But what we need to know about is that actually there's one very important statement and documents right before the war that people should pay more attention with, is this Xi Jinping and Putin joint statement on February 4th, that right before the Winter Olympic that they met in Beijing, and then they issued a joint statement. And a lot of the content of the joint statement, people might regard it as unsurprising repetition of what they have been saying. But actually in the joint statement, that there's an English version in the Kremlin's webpage. Interestingly, on the China side, they don't put the English versions on the webpage. They have the Chinese translation, but it actually outlined a vision of the world order without U.S. hegemony, and definitely that now there's a lot of discussion about whether when Putin and Xi Jinping met, Putin had told Xi Jinping what he's going to do, whether Xi Jinping know that there is a full-scale invasion being planned. Some people said yes, some people said no. But it is not beyond. It's beyond the main concern here, because China and Russia might have some tactical difference in terms of whether the full-scale invasion is prudent or whether timing is good and things like that. But strategically, as shown in that statement, they share a very similar worldview. That what I see is a worldview of irredentist empires. As somebody said, that what Putin tried to do is not to scale back the world to 1989, and he is trying to scale back the world to 1889. And as right before the war, Putin made like a 1-hour speech on February 21st, and he is accusing the Bolshevik of having this Soviet Republic system and everything else. So he's really very explicit in trying to revive the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union. And actually in the nationalist discourse of China is the same, that they talk about 100 years of humiliation. They talk about ever since the 1840s, the Opium War, China lost what it had to Western imperialism. And what they want to restore is the world order, or at least in Asia, back to 1840s, which is a Sinocentric tributary system in which all other kingdoms or countries in the region tribute vessels, the subsidiary to China. So in this kind of a world will to revive two pre-modern empires, they are very much in sync with one another. Even I would say that China right now has all the reason to wish Putin success because China is watching the development right now. And some people already in the US already point out that actually it is a try-one or rehearsal of what the US and its allies could do when China attacked Taiwan and also being more aggressive in the South China Sea. That is, US doesn't want to go directly to war with a big nuclear power. So they will arm their resistance like what it is doing in Ukraine now. And actually that even the kind of weapons that the US has been selling to Taiwan is similar. The Stinger missiles, it's now the new items that in case of an invasion. And at the same time, to use a maximal economic sanctions. So it is what the US has been doing to Russia, and people expect that when if China attack Taiwan, invade Taiwan, that the US and its ally would do the same. So from this perspective, we can see two scenarios. One scenario is that Putin get away from all these sanctions, survive, and successfully absorb Ukraine. If it is the case, that I don't think it is not likely. I don't think it is likely. But if it is the case, then China will feel much more empowered and comfortable and confident in doing similar thing in Taiwan, because if Putin and Russia is a relatively weaker economy can survive this kind of sanctions, then and why China cannot survive the sanctions in case of an invasion of Taiwan, and so it will be to China's advantage if Putin succeeds. If Putin failed or even toppled in the process, in a coup or whatever, and then it will change the calculus of Beijing about Taiwan and even about South China Sea totally, and then they will be much more reluctant or careful and cautious in doing anything aggressive about Taiwan and South China Sea. So the success and failure of Putin, the invasion of Ukraine, will be closely watched by Beijing, and then there's all reasons, every reasons that Beijing will wish Putin's luck. But the other problem is that what China can do to help Putin and Russia, and there's a huge risk on the part of China, not only reputational risks and people perception of China risks, but also actual economic, let alone political risks, that if China or any Chinese entities and companies help Russia, that we need to remember that the Chinese tech company Huawei was under sanctions now, and it is getting into big trouble and cut off from US chips and computer microchips and all that supplies. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one reason is that Huawei was found actually helping Iran to get away from the sanction. And then it even lead to the detaining of the chief financial officers Wang Wanzhou in Canada, with the prospect of being extradited to the US, and then create all kind of diplomatic crisis. And a lot of Chinese companies already get sanctions because of they are found helping North Korea to bypass the sanctions. So the calculus of Beijing is that they definitely they will do whatever they can to illicitly help Putin and Russia to get around the sanction without being noticed by the international community. But it is very difficult to do, because the US Commerce Department already warned sternly that if any Chinese banks and Chinese economic entities were found helping Russia, that US and will lead its ally to sanction China. So that is a kind of a balance act that China need to find out how to do it. But strategically, China is very much on par with Putin in terms of what an ideal world order would be like. And then another troubling thing is that we always look at this issue from big powers, Russia, China, US, or maybe even Iran and other big powers. But actually that what the small states in the region, including not only Ukraine but also Poland and all these Baltic states and Eastern European states and smaller states in East Asia, including the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan. Will what they take from this crisis is that we already know that North Korea is very adamant in keeping this its nuclear program because they see what happened to the Gaddafi regime in Libya after they give up the nuclear program, and in the end they were toppled. So they hold on very cleanly to their nuclear program. And what happened actually in the Cold War with Taiwan and South Korea and Japan is that they did have a nuclear program. They want to have a nuclear deterrence, but US stopped them. And for the sake of non-proliferation and offer the kind of a security guarantee in exchange for their giving up their nuclear program. So it's basically a similar thing or logic behind the 1994 Budapest memorandum that make Ukraine give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantee from actually Russia, UK, and US. But now that Ukraine is in fame, and then if in the end Ukraine was absorbed by Russia and then was defeated ultimately. And then what happened next, I worry, in Asia and in other places in the world is that it's not only that North Korea will become very keen in holding on to the nuclear program, but Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan might be actually, we already see some chatter among some quarter in the foreign policy circle and opposition party to talk about reviving the nuclear program. So it will be a kind of a Israelization. That is, Israel has been U.S. ally, but they actually don't quite trust and totally rely on U.S. protection, so they have their bond.
Fung, if you could start to wrap up, please, that would be great.
Sure. Then, so that is the kind of uncharted territory that no matter what happened, how the war end up in a kind of a long Iraqization of Ukraine or whatever, that it is going to be chaotic environment in which there's a lot of risks, and the international left definitely has a lot of dilemma facing this kind of a new uncharted territory and situation in the world. So let me stop here and then look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ho-Fung. That was great. So last but not least, we're going to turn to our fifth speaker, Erin Cass. Erin is a member of the Tempest Collective and a queer Romani data scientist and activist based in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. Their writing has appeared in publications including Spectre, Tempest, and Socialist Worker. And as well as Tempest, they're a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Erin, please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. First, I just want to say thank you so much to my fellow panelists for being here today. It's so important for us as socialists to be able to connect across the borders that capitalism imposes on us. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. And I hope we continue to have similar opportunities and more frequently as we move forward into what I see as a new era of inter-imperialist rivalry, which many of you have touched on. I believe that as we enter into this new stage, our connections will only become more necessary as we struggle together to build an international working class movement for socialism and to fight for a better world together, especially in a digital world where we're so overwhelmed with information and misinformation. Forming international connections with each other can help us to really best understand and situate ourselves in our material reality. Obviously, there's a lot to cover in 10 minutes and it's difficult. So I applaud the rest of you for doing that. Today, I'd like to just touch on a few main topics relating specifically what I believe and would argue that socialists in the United States should be doing and arguing for during this horrifying political moment. The first of those is supporting Ukraine's right to self-determination and self-defense. The second is supporting the Russian anti-war movement. And the third is working here in the United States to build an anti-war movement that's grounded in the politics of international solidarity from below. The right to self-determination against imperial aggression is essential for liberation. And there's really been a rise of campus politics in the United States spanning many years now, the rise of this idea that's already been pointed out of, the enemy of my enemy of the United States is my friend sort of perspectives. And I think previously it was easier to hold on to this position, as Gilbert pointed out, in a world that was more black and white and unipolar, with the US as a sole hegemon carrying out its global imperial project. And now the war in Ukraine has really forced some of those carrying this position to pivot rapidly, while others have really hunkered down even further. And so I want to make clear that I think there's just one very basic position that US socialists should be taking right now together, and that is the position of absolute support for Ukrainians' right to defend themselves against Russian imperialism. I think there should be no more centering the debate on the pretenses of Putin denazifying Ukraine, or Putin is justified because, NATO has expanded, or any of the other positions we've seen come out in the past weeks that don't center Ukrainian struggle. Because ultimately what's happening right now is a violent occupation. Does that mean we shouldn't talk about the rise of fascism or the constant looming threat of NATO expansion? No, absolutely not. Like, we should 100% be talking about those things, but we can't sacrifice the critical element right now of support for the Ukrainian people. And standing in solidarity with Ukraine does not prevent us from being critical of NATO. I think that's a really false dichotomy that's dominated the left in the United States. And I believe Lenin was right in arguing that socialists are duty bound to conduct an implacable struggle against all those who at any time defend or sanction national oppression in general, or the denial of the right of nations to self-determination. We must stand for the right of people everywhere to their own self-determination. And right now, I think it's crucial that we listen to our Ukrainian comrades' assessments and their needs without impulsive judgment, which is hard for us Americans to do, right? But the resistance is not homogenous, none of them are. And building connections among the international socialist left can ensure that we can trust comrades on the ground when they're expressing needs and offering insight and analysis that we just can't have from so far away. And we can't build an international anti-war movement without those real relationships. As Russia oppresses Ukraine through an intense campaign of military occupation, we must also acknowledge the devastating economic oppression of Ukraine by the United States through, entrapment from its global finance enforcers, the World Bank and the IMF, which have crippled the Ukrainian economy with over $6 billion in debt and astronomical interest payments. And so I think that staring into the face of either defeat at the hands of an imperial power or heightened Western military intervention and economic bondage to defend your home is something that deserves praise and respect and support and solidarity. And so on that point, I'll say we really must demand the immediate withdrawal of all occupying troops in Ukraine. We should oppose NATO intervention, which would trigger a massive military confrontation. And we should oppose the remilitarization of Europe, which we're seeing in full force, particularly alarmingly so in Germany. We should demand the opening of all borders to all refugees, not just white Ukrainian refugees. I myself am Romani. I have family in Ukraine who've not been able to leave. There are many African refugees in Ukraine who've not been able to leave. There are also many refugees from all over the world who are not welcomed. And now suddenly, we're seeing Schengen open up for some people and not for others. And finally, we should call for the immediate cancellation of all Ukrainian debt. As we stand with the Ukrainian people, we must also offer support and solidarity to the Russian anti-war movement. As our Russian comrades lose access to communications channels as a result of widespread censorship and are risking arrest and really lengthy imprisonment for speaking out against the invasion, it's crucial that we offer them support in their resistance and in their struggle. As young people, as working people in Russia are being cut off and are facing massive risk to stand against the Putin regime. And I believe the Russian anti-war movement is a really critical piece in the possibility of ending this war. And in the midst of heightened state repression, Russians are facing the repercussions of a brutal onslaught of sanctions and financial restrictions by the West in an attempt to tank the Russian economy. And there's been support for sanctions on the left in the United States, and a showing of like social nationalism and patriotism that I would argue we really need to push back against as internationalists. Sanctions are felt most acutely by working class people. Sanctions kill people. Sanctions are very notoriously hard to lift once they're imposed. And will the United States offer to welcome in a massive wave of Russian economic refugees created by those sanctions? The combination of that domestic state repression and external economic destruction by the West is certainly combining now to galvanize a generation of young Russians whose futures are on the line. And we need to stand in solidarity with those folks and with the Russian people who are opposing the war. Sanctions and military action don't end conflict. They just don't. They intensify it. And so we really need to continue to come together to build an international anti-war movement that's grounded in solidarity from below. The US has moved at such rapid fire speed in the imposition of those financial restrictions and seems to be very set on increasing our already massive military budget. And as we all know, an arms race between the nuclear powers of the world will only end in destruction and will end very poorly for all of us. And that's why I think it's essential that we really double down on our efforts to build an international anti-war movement from below across national boundaries that demands an immediate end to war and for demilitarization. And whatever semblance there maybe was of a US anti-war movement has been absolutely decimated. We find ourselves facing an unfortunately enormous task of rebuilding an anti-war movement in the context of a very fractured, weakened, and non-unified left. The demonstrations across the country over the past couple of weeks here have been largely attended by Ukrainian nationals. And there's been a very weak, but also confrontational presence from the left. And the tone, I'd say, of most actions, across the nation are fairly liberal in their demands, have called for sanctions, the imposition of a no-fly zone, and generally for Western intervention. And where socialists have managed to actually show up to these actions, they've unfortunately taken a more hostile approach in arguing against those demands. And I think we need a different tactical approach to win over a larger number of people to our politics, because hostility and confrontation with those coming out against war won't help us grow. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't engage in comradely debate and discussion on why we oppose those types of demands, but we have to do it from a place of respect and empathy, which is something that I feel is so foreign and lacking on the US left and has been for a long time. And the fracturing of the anti-war movement over the past decades has left us very ill-equipped for the historical moment that we find ourselves in. So creating some time and space for education and respectful discussion will enable us to become more adept as we take to the streets and interact with a growing movement that's very different in character from the movements we've seen thus far in the period of the new left. And so with that, I'll just say that here in the US, we really need to prioritize education and empathetic and informed intervention as we play our part in building international solidarity from below against war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was great. So we're going to jump into a quick sort of lightning round, so to speak, going through the same order to give our panelists just, 2 to 3 minutes to just weigh in on any additional points. And I want to just take a moment before I turn it back to Gilbert to please remind people to be respectful and comradely to others in the chat. And there's a lot of important debates and so on, but we want to really make sure that we're having these discussions in as comradely a forum as possible. So please bear that in mind. So Gilbert, just a couple quick minutes if you'd like to weigh in. And then after Gilbert, I will turn it over to Ilya.
Yeah. Thank you, Lee. Well, I want first of all to second what Erin said. I think Erin very clearly articulated what, in my view, should be the socialist internationalist position in the United States and, generally speaking, anywhere actually, but more specifically in the United States and in other imperialist countries. The key point here is that the Pavlovian so-called left, because they are not left actually, those who stand with Russia through the angle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which Erin just mentioned, don't realize that Vladimir Putin has made a huge service, has just paid a huge service to NATO. I mean, I said in another interview that, I mean, half jokingly, that NATO should give him honorary membership and the problem is solved. Because if his problem is that he has served NATO more than anyone else. And he has created conditions for Western imperialism not to rearm or remilitarize, because they were already armed and militarized, but to increase tremendously this militarizing trend. And we can see how much people like Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, all of them profited politically. They are very happy with what Vladimir Putin has done in invading Ukraine. That you know created much better political conditions for them. That's what is happening. And the issue is today, the resistance of the Ukrainian people to Russian imperialism is a defining moment for all of us. Because if Putin succeeds in subjugating Ukraine, this trend that started now will go, you know, skyrocketing. Whereas if this imperialist invasion is defeated, then we will have a much stronger moment in Western countries to fight against NATO, for the dissolution of NATO, for disarmament, against all these increases in military expenditure. It takes one to be really completely, blind to the, or let me use another term, someone not to understand what is going on, you know, to keep applauding Vladimir Putin for what is going on in the name of anti-imperialism. This is really completely, sorry for the term, but idiotic anti-imperialism.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. I'm going to turn it over to Ilya as well for 2 to 3 quick minutes, and then back to Volodymyr following.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was a bit disappointed by some comments in the chat, and especially I want to clarify this idea of denazification that was put by Vladimir Putin as a main justification of the war in Ukraine. So you have to understand that, of course, you have a variety of imperialist powers in the world. But for now, we see how one of them, Russia, is using the imperialist language from 100 years ago. And the victory of Putin will somehow legitimize this kind of language. So what is the idea of Putin behind this denazification? So he truly believes that Ukraine as a country and Ukrainians as the people, they are not exist. That is a kind of, let's say, ideology, false consciousness. And he wants to destroy this false consciousness by a military force. So according to his point of view, Ukraine, or I don't know, Poland, or any small nation is not a subject of politics. So there are just Russia, United States, China, probably India, probably European Union, but that's not clear, that should honestly meet each other and divide the world into the spheres of influence. That is the open kind of statement by Putin. And those left, but not really left, but for me, they're just a bunch of Putin's, propagandists who adopt this language. They, in fact, defend the very idea, the very concept of what is imperialism is about. And that is very decisive moment for all the left, for all the true anti-imperialists to fight against any adaptation of this imperialist way of thinking that is proposed by Putin and that is supported and justified his invasion on Ukraine.
Thank you, Ilya, so much. Volodymyr, if you'd like to chime in for a couple minutes. I think you're muted, comrade.
Apologies, yes, I was muted. I could comment on many things that we've discussed and the questions in the chat. I mean, as a Ukrainian, I should be the first to question what is Ukrainian people actually and how anything unified or whatever. But I mean, from political point of view, I think that's the biggest priority right now is to achieve an immediate ceasefire and more or less stable peaceful solution for this. In order to achieve this, the discussion about sanctions, it just stops being something very abstract about some abstract people in Russia who might suffer. But at this moment, at the beginning of the war, it is one of the instruments to stop Putin's invasion. The same relates to this supply of the weapons to Ukraine. So if you want to stop Russian army, you need to increase pressure on Russia and you need to increase pressure on Russia within Ukraine. But if the West is doing only these things, sanctions and weapons, without actively brokering for a compromise peace solution between Ukraine and Russia, that might require some very painful compromises by Ukrainian government, who is in a weaker position at this moment. That means that the West is actually interested in the prolongation of the war and turning Ukraine into kind of a European Afghanistan for their own very distant from the interests of the people in Ukraine or Russia interests, and for the biggest damage that would be actually imposed on Ukrainian people and on Ukrainian cities and on Ukrainian lives. And we would speak about hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions dead. So if there is any opportunity to stop this war by any compromise solution in a short term, that should be achieved. Weapons sanctions are tools about this, but of course they should be supplemented by a very active diplomacy and search for a compromise that might include also the Ukraine's neutrality, for example, that may also be helped with given a real prospect of EU membership to Ukraine in order for Zelensky to get support for the peace deal within Ukrainian society. And in order even to discuss these things, we also need to keep in mind the complicity of the West in what's going on now in Ukraine. And we need to be able to talk about this and not to simply to dismiss the criticism of NATO and the Western policies, not in really constructive way.
Thanks so much, Volodymyr. So turning next to Ho-Fung for just a couple quick minutes, and then
Sure.
we'll go to Erin, and then we'll open it up to the audience questions.
I don't have much to add. I just want to echo what is said about this mentality of enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of mentality. It used to be easier if the enemy of my enemy is the Vietcong or Che Guevara, but it's definitely much difficult now with Putin, or even earlier the Islamic theocratic states and that kind of enemy of the enemy. And actually, I find this interesting. It is parallel to the discussion about the policing and neighborhood back in the U.S. and domestic area, that many places police force in large parts are racist and brutal. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we can be friends of drug cartel and human trafficker who want to get rid of the police and take control of the streets. But it is a dilemma that when we worry about the militarization of the Europe. While it is very real that Germany is going to beef up its military budget big time, and NATO is problematic, but at the same time, we need to find or imagine a practical alternative security arrangement for these smaller states, particularly that under the shadow of the Russian Empire, so that they don't need to only rely on the US or NATO as a kind of a hedge against the security threat posed by the reviving empire. The same with respect to East Asia, to all the smaller states living under the shadow of China. So it's what 2 cents I want to add.
Thank you so much. And then finally, Erin, back over to you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I don't think that I have anything to add. I appreciate that there's some variety in opinion on the panel. I'm enjoying having this discussion, and I'd just like to cede my time so we can have more time for audience questions.
Okay, fantastic. So thanks, Erin. Thanks to all the comrades and speakers and so on. So we have had a great number of questions that have come in. And so some of them have been specifically directed to some of you. So I'm going to start here. And the first one is actually directed specifically to Volodymyr, but also to anyone else who might want to comment. So I'm going to read it out. It's just bear with me. It's got a couple parts to it. So the question comes from Michael Tucker in the UK, and he's asking, on the left, there are 3 common themes regularly raised to discredit the Ukrainian opposition to Russia or to justify Putin's actions. One, that in 2014, there was a coup most likely arranged by the USA to remove Yanukovych. 2, the rebellion in the Donbas provinces was a genuine popular uprising against Kyiv. Since the Minsk agreement, Ukraine has been responsible for most of the violations, the agreement, and for the 1,400 deaths. And 3, the Ukrainian government has been heavily influenced not just by Ukrainian nationalist political traditions, but by fascist traditions. So Volodymyr and anyone else, how valid do you think these assumptions are?
Look, I've been writing about all these things since 2014, and I could go on to discuss every of this topic for hours, actually. And you might Google my interviews and publications where I specifically discuss the influence of Ukrainian radical nationalists on the Ukrainian politics, what exactly was the Euromaidan revolution in 2014, how influential was the West in post-Euromaidan Ukrainian politics. I mean, what exactly we would like to know answering this question? Whether Putin had the right to start the war in Ukraine? No, he didn't. Even if everything of this was true, because of course Ukraine has a problem with radical nationalists who had disproportionate influence on Ukrainian politics. But this is Ukrainian problem. And we as Ukrainians needed to deal with our own fascists, not with the help of Russian army. That's one thing. We as Ukrainians needed to liberate ourselves from the increasing dependency on the United States and turning Ukraine into a kind of like US client state. We as Ukrainians, we needed to have a better revolution than happened in 2014. That's very simple political answers to these questions, and in no way this could justify bombing Ukrainian cities and starting to invade Ukrainian land with full-scale invasion.
And a follow-up question for you, Volodymyr, along the same lines. A question, Maria Harwell asks, I struggle with trying to understand what the Ukrainian people want. Obviously, they are not a monolith, but what Ukrainian political groups have had their voices amplified over more marginalized Ukrainian voices, I wonder. For example, we have seen rampant racism against African Ukrainians recently. What do racial minority groups in Ukraine want to happen?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
The question relates to the interests and concerns and demands of racial minorities in Ukraine currently, and which voices on the ground in Ukraine are being more highlighted than the others. And specifically for one, the question of what Africans currently in Ukraine are facing.
Look, the issue of the minorities in Ukraine is usually not discussed in the racial terms, because the number of the racialized people in Ukraine is not that great as in the imperial metropolitan countries, which had a number of colonies. Ukraine didn't have colonies. And at most they had the students from Africa or from Asian countries who came to study in Ukrainian universities. And now they were actually got into a very difficult situation when they cannot escape Ukraine because they won't be let into the Schengen zone with their African or Asian passports. They would require a visa or something like this, so that they're actually in a very difficult situation. Discussion of the political and cultural diversity within Ukraine is hugely important, and it was very much underestimated. And even within this discussion, we are talking about some unified Ukrainian people, some unified Ukrainian resistance, as if all Ukrainians want something the same. They don't, and Ukrainians behave in a very different way in reacting to this war. Some are joining the army, some are protesting in Ukrainian cities in a peaceful way, joining rallies. But over 2 million already, maybe 3 million by this moment, fled Ukraine. They escaped to the European Union. Some are just sitting at home and waiting which power would take hold in their city. Some are now already starting to collaborate with the Russians. So Ukrainians are diverse. Ukrainians are as any nation in the world. We have very different opinions. We have very different interests. And that would require, of course, like hours to discuss all the implications of this diversity. And of course, one of the problems that contributed to this conflict and to the war, that there is no recognition that Ukrainians are different, that they are diverse, they could want different things. And not simply recognition, but also institutionalizing this diversity in a democratic way in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you, comrade. I'm going to move on to another question here, and this is perhaps a question for Erin or Gilbert, but really anyone on the panel who'd like to take this up. It's a sort of a wider question. It comes from Russell Dale, who says, I don't think Russia is imperialist in the same sense that the US and Western Europe are. And I don't think that simply accepting US military hegemony is a good idea. Can this sort of thinking be addressed? Who would like to, anyone here who might want to jump in? Yeah, Gilbert?
Okay, if Erin doesn't want. Well, first of all, I'll take the question seriously. By any definition of imperialism, Russia is an imperialist state. It's a monopoly and a mixture of monopoly capitalism and state capitalism. It has an imperial outreach. It's intervening in various countries in the world, in Syria, in Libya, in Sudan, where, by the way, it's the only superpower supporting the putschists, the generals who are trying to crush the popular movement in Sudan. It's intervening in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is, by any standard, an imperialist power. That's absolutely obvious to anyone who is not, as I said, just applauding Vladimir Putin. And by the way, I said that applauding Vladimir Putin in the name of anti-imperialism is idiotic. Some people reacted as if I insulted them. Then if they find themselves defined by the fact of applauding Vladimir Putin, that's their problem. Okay, so on the other hand, I just said, the problem is that this action plays in the hands of US imperialism and its allies. Vladimir Putin is helping, is creating perfect condition. You know, at the end of the Cold War, the whole debates were about, well, the United States is now without a peer competitor and it needs to create one. And some people believe that Osama bin Laden was that, or Saddam Hussein, but these guys are you know, a small beer. They don't represent anything like the Soviet Union. But Russia today is playing that role which the United States wanted, because the United States ostracized Russia at the end of the Cold War in order precisely to keep some bogey state, bogeyman, if you want, in the heart of Europe, in order to get those other European countries under US protection, remain under US protection. That must, I mean, it doesn't take, you know, a lot of subtlety to understand what's going on politically.
Thank you, Gilbert. I'd love to bring Erin, but also Ilya in particular, to speak on. Love to hear your comments, Ilya, on the nature of Russia and the question of imperialism. And if Russia is an imperialist power.
Yeah, I think that Russia is imperialist power, and now we have a very serious proofs for it. And it's so strange to see that the people who are trying to deny it or somehow downplay with this, with the thing, they moved from the discussion of what is right now happening in Ukraine to some other questions, to some other issues. Yeah. So I think that that we need to understand that what is happening now, it's a classical imperialist war. It's a classical imperialist invasion of such a scale that probably was not happened in let's say in this part of the world in Europe for last 100 years. And that
Ilya, are you finished, or was that your internet cutting out?
yeah. So I maybe can add that probably not all of you know that when Vladimir Putin gave his speech just before the war was started, was a very detailed explanation of Ukrainian history, and basically the main idea was exactly the same, that Ukraine is the part of historical Russian lands. He focused on a very clear anti-Bolshevik stance. His idea was that Ukraine as a country was invented by Lenin and by Bolshevism. And what he is now doing by the military invasion, he is doing the real decommunization of Ukraine. It's his words, yeah. So, and if you want to understand where is the historical, logical end of the Soviet project, of let's say of the union based on the idea of the national liberation and self-determination, that is exactly what is happening now. What is happening now is a dissolvement of the final dissolvement of the Lenin's national project, the very idea of the self-determination. Yeah, and that that should be extremely important for every internationalist, for every socialist, for every Marxist for the moment.
Thanks so much, comrade. Is there anyone else that would like to weigh in on this question of the nature of imperialism? Yeah, Erin, please.
Yeah, I think that you've raised an important question, Russell, that is, has come up in discussion a lot in the last few weeks, and I welcome it. I think that there is a difference. Like, I don't think that the imperial project of the United States is identical to that of Russia. They're not the same. And I don't think anybody here would argue that they are. But I think, if we have to boil down, like, what is an imperialist power to a simple definition, which is not an easy task, for me, I think it has a lot to do with economic capitalist development in that state. Getting to whatever the stage of like monopoly capitalism and how much power the elite and the state has derived at that certain point in their capitalist development. And I think Russia is very clearly at that point. I think that the invasion of Ukraine comes with, certain political goals, but also with the seizure of natural resources. And there's an economic component to it that very clearly fits in with what I think I would describe as an imperial project. And so I think that to me is clear. And I think that, not all imperial states are the same, but we should oppose all forms of imperialism when we see them. I think that's our duty as socialists.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Volodymyr, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would also like to add here. I think the question of Russian imperialism should not be simplified, and we at least need to understand what kind of imperialism it is, and not pretend that it is just the same thing as the imperialism of the United States or the imperialism of Western European states or even Chinese imperialism. We need to understand better the process of degradation and stagnation in the post-Soviet condition and what kind of imperialism it could produce. And that's something that is not properly understood. And it precisely in discussion of the war, because this war is actually not helping Russian big business. It actually damages Russian big business, Russian rich elite, with the enormous sanctions they are now suffering. And so it would be very difficult to claim that the war was started by Russian finance capital in order to expand their markets and get raw resources from Ukraine. The understanding of the war is now more like fixed to the imperialist or imperial, which are different things actually, ideology that could be driving Putin and the ruling clique within Russia, and what kind of social group could have this kind of ideology. And at the same time, I would return back what I tried to say in my presentation in the beginning, that actually the imperialist project of contemporary Russia is not really developed so much. It has not gained such popularity, and that's precisely one of the consequences. Is that precisely that the Russian society was startled with the start of the war. They were not prepared for the war, and they were not seeing that the solution for the problems between Russia and Ukraine should be the massive invasion. That's precisely because there is no actual popular support for this imperialist project within the Russian society, and that should also be kept in mind in understanding what Russia is doing and how it's developing.
Okay, thanks so much, Volodymyr. I'm going to bring Ho-Fung in here, and then I do have one kind of small batch of questions about the character of the anti-war movement, so which I want to be able to get to. So Ho-Fung, please go ahead.
Yeah, just two quick points is that look back in history, one actually interesting case of comparison in the older age of inter-imperial rivalry is the Empire of Japan in the 1930s and the 1940s. It is framed itself as an anti-imperialist imperialist. Actually, that it's self-inflicted kind of a mission is to get rid of the Western imperialism in Asia. So it is righteous, and in the end, it is much more brutal and aggressive. And in the end, many people colonized by European power end up fighting side by side with the European colonizer against the Japanese Empire. So it's one example of historical parallel. The second quick point is that during the Soviet China split, Mao Zedong characterized Soviet Union as a social imperialist. So it is imperialist, but at least it is a social part. But now that the Putin kind of imperialism is much more fascistic, and look at the domestic agenda. So it's not an accident that many extreme right-wing groups in the US and UK and Europe is actually an admirer of Putin because it's anti-LGBTQ, it is super macho, and advocating all kind of racial myth and things like that. So actually that you look at Fox News and Nigel Farage and all these Brexit people, actually they have been praising Putin. That in their imagination, they might even think that it is how a kind of a Trump dictatorship should look like. It is a Putin Russia. So it is their model. So it is one factor that we have to take into account when we discuss how we deal with Putin or Putin kind of imperialism.
Thank you so much, Ho-Fung. Gilbert, I'm going to bring you in super briefly so that we can get to the question on the anti-war movement as well. Thank you.
Very briefly, just 2 points very briefly. One is that the two major sectors of the Russian economy are the oil and gas sector and the arms industry. And one can make a point that these two sectors are benefiting from the war. Now, that's one point. The second point is that the ongoing war is not an inter-imperialist war. It's a war. It's a war of resistance against an imperialist invasion. If NATO were to enter the war, then it would transform that war into an inter-imperialist war, and in which we would have the classical position that we have against inter-imperialist wars, including revolutionary defeatism in that case. But this is not the case. We shouldn't confuse what is going on, which is a just war of resistance, of popular resistance against an imperialist invasion, confuse that with an inter-imperialist war. There's a difference between when two imperialist countries are fighting each other and between a case where one imperialist country is invading another, even if the other imperialist camp is helping or sending arms or weapons to the side that is invaded. That it happens all the time. That doesn't make those wars, inter-imperialist wars. And so we must fully support the Ukrainian people's fight against Russian imperialism in the same way that we would support the Venezuelan people and even their state fight against an invasion by American imperialism. That's the kind of position we have, which is against imperialism of all kinds.
Okay, thank you so much, Gilbert. I'm going to sort of slightly, switch gears, but to bring in two questions that take up the nature of the anti-war movement, but also pull in the question of sanctions. And the first one is from Paul Street, who asks, Will sanctions help or hurt chances for a potent anti-war movement in Russia? So that's the question about Russia in particular. And then a question from Haley Pesson about the resistance outside of the region. Groups that uncritically support Russia are tiny compared to the massive sympathy for Ukraine, but that's also led to calls for US intervention like no-fly zones, sanctions, etc. How can we work to win others to opposing both imperialisms while supporting the Ukrainian resistance? So those are two questions, and I will kind of open it up to whichever on the panel, whoever on the panel would like to jump in.
Can I comment the first questions on sanctions?
Please.
So, in fact, in this huge wave of different sanctions against Russia, you can somehow find two main type of sanctions. So the first are the sanctions against the Russian elite, and the second are the sanctions against Russian central bank, the biggest Russian corporations, and so on. So one part of sanctions somehow pretend to force Russian elite to change the course of the country. The second type of sanctions simply pretend to crush the Russian economy and to destabilize the regime. So in fact, the most people who will suffer from the second type of sanctions will be the majority of the population of the country. And we know that this type of sanctions, of course, they can destabilize the regime. And in fact, I think that this is the biggest challenge for the Putin's regime that it was ever confronted, but it could, as we know from the history of sanctions against Iran, Cuba, and so on, it could have a different opposite effect, and it could somehow help Putin to concentrate his power. The second let's say the sanctions against elite, there are sanctions that could be definitely supported by the socialists across the globe, I believe. And I think that what we should criticize, that these sanctions against the Russian elite, against the property of the Russian big businessmen and so on in Europe, that could be a real useful way to prevent such aggressive politics of regime. And the main problem that we have for now, the mixture of these two types of sanctions. Of course, we should oppose the sanctions which provide the suffer for the population, and we can support the sanctions, yes, against the Russian ruling class, against the Russian elite, the personal.
Thank you, Ilya. I appreciate it. So again, open it to the others on the panel, both to speak specifically about sanctions against Russia, but also the other question about how do we build an anti-imperialist left in a nutshell. Is there anyone that would like to jump in?
On the sanction, that I would like to add that this round of sanction against Russia, again, that we are in the very much uncharted territory, that the past record of sanction is not very good, is not very effective in achieving its goals against Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. But this time is a bit different because the sanction against Russia is so airtight, much more airtight than the past sanctions. So what is the fallout that we would lead to is remain to be seen. The other thing is that besides sanctions, that we can also think about from the perspective of divestment, that actually the transnational corporations always has a tendency of doing business whenever there's a profit without any moral or social consideration. So it is why that many, for example, Ben and Jerry, the ice cream who is owned by Unilever, which is a kind of European company, have a lot of Russian investment. Actually, before the war in January, they have a tweet and saying that that there's no war, Putin is peaceful, and it's just Biden drumming up the war drum and that kind of Russian propaganda thing. So this kind of TNC has this tendency from collaborating with the Nazis in the 30s to South Africa, to all this kind of thing that they do. So thinking from another perspective, we really need to build a movement in which to prevent this transnational cooperation from aiding this kind of a brutal regime, no matter it is about genocide in Xinjiang and also imperialist powers in the Putin regimes, and without hurting the people, ordinary people in those countries. So it is the perspective of the divestment that we need to think about.
Thank you so much, Ho-Fung. We are, Erin, I don't know if you would like to, okay, perfect. So Erin, I'm going to call on you, and then given the time, we're, we might start to shift gears to closing remarks. Erin, go ahead, comrade.
Yeah, so I think if I remember the question correctly that Haley posed, I think that it's something that I've been putting a lot of thought into because of how poorly I think that like leftist interventions have gone in the demonstrations that have happened so far in the last few weeks. And I think it comes back to, and I know that this is, I said this a lot in my talk, but is like, we need to be better at building real relationships with people when we're like at actions and when we're actually, organizing and engaging in direct action. And we need to approach those conversations in a lot more respectful and empathetic way than I think has been common on the left in the United States for a long time, because I think, this is not an abstract thing. This is a real war, and people are dying, and it's a very emotional and charged thing to talk about when you're engaging in political conversations, especially with people that you don't know, that you're like meeting out at a protest or at a demonstration. And so I think that approaching those conversations with a lot more care and just being better at listening to the people who we're talking to who do support sanctions. And there is like widespread support for all types of sanctions in the US without the sorts of distinction that Ilya raised. I think those distinctions are important things that we should be talking about with the people that we're engaging with, out on the street and as we're trying to build this movement. But it needs to be done in a lot more respectful way than it has been. I mean, even looking at the chat today, it's like we're supposed to be on the same side, and we don't always have to agree, but we need to be able to have these conversations and these debates in like a much more emotionally mature and intelligent way than has been happening. And so I think that if we want to successfully oppose all forms of imperialism and talk really about like what can we do to bring about the end of this war, but also to really challenge the like heightened militarization that we're seeing in our lifetimes, that is terrifying. We need to be better towards each other and a lot better at listening and making those sorts of arguments in more respectful ways.
Thank you so much, comrades. Comrade, I don't know if there's anyone that would like to weigh in specifically on this, but we are just about 10 minutes from our wrap-up time, which it's been a phenomenal conversation. Perhaps what I'll do is turn it back to each of you to just take, again, another quick 2 to 3 minutes, and then we can kind of pull this to a close. I think that's the best way. So we kind of did this in order before, starting with Gilbert. I don't know if you would like to do that, or anyone else who'd like to jump in first. Gilbert, would you like to say some last closing 2 minutes?
Maybe someone else would.
Yeah. Anyone for last couple of comments?
Let me jump in a little bit. That getting back to this Xi Jinping and Putin joint statement on February 4th, there's a minor point, actually not that minor, which is actually showing the contradictory consideration between geopolitics and economy. Because in the joint statement, they actually advocate the special sphere of influence for Russia and China, getting rid of the US domination in the two regions. But at the same time, the statement also say that they want to uphold unfettered free trade of the world, even at the point of attacking this green tariff or carbon tariff that in the statement, there's a saying that, actually, we don't want protectionism even in the name of fighting climate change. So they are still advocating a free trade agenda, global free trade, but unfortunately that this kind of a two agenda, global free trade and the spheres of influence, inter-imperial rivalry, cannot coexist. That we have to accept that no matter how the war ends, we are going to be in a world without a global free trade economy. It's much more like this autarchies of spheres of influence in the 1930s and 1940s, in which there are free trade within each sphere of influence. But you can imagine that Russia and China, or the other great power, that fearing sanction and will unplug themselves from dependencies on the US dollar and the US economy and Western economy. And the same, the Biden administration already explicitly talking about this, reducing its dependence on China in terms of supply chain. Whether they can do it is another matter, but this kind of unplugging, reducing interdependence is already in the air, and it's going to accelerate it no matter how the war ends. So we are going to be living in a world of conflicting spheres of influence, even if it's not war. There are going to be a lot of inter-autarky economic protectionist friction.
Thank you, Ho-Fung. Closing remarks from anyone else? Gilbert, Ilya, Volodymyr, Erin? There's been a lot that's been said in the chat too. If you would, if you want to incorporate.
I can unblock the situation and speak instead of the remaining block. No, just to just wrap up precisely to repeat my point. I think that the Ukrainian popular resistance today to the Russian imperialist invasion is important for us all, because on its outcome will depend a lot. We have a stake as anti-imperialists, as anti-war people all over the world. We have a stake in the success of this resistance, because if Vladimir Putin gets hold of Ukraine, manages to control, invade, and do what he wants with the country, then we will enter a situation where, for instance, as anti-war or anti-NATO forces, we will be marginalized by the dominant ideology that will prevail at that point, which will be one of confrontation, of Russia seen as a new Nazi Germany or something like that. So in order for our struggle everywhere against NATO, against imperialism, against war, against all imperialisms with S, we need the Ukrainian people to succeed in its resistance to that brutal invasion.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Ilya, Volodymyr, Erin, love to hear some closing comments if you'd like to. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I can share some. I guess first I want to say thank you to the four of you for being here. This has been a really interesting and enlightening discussion, and I really appreciate hearing your perspectives. And I really hope we can do more of this. I think it's important that we continue to have have events like this and continue to have conversations across borders to build up a stronger international left. And I guess I'll just close with saying, you know, I hope moving forward we can have a unified message of Russia out of Ukraine, no to imperialism, no to NATO, and yes to building an international anti-war movement from below. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks so much. Okay, well, Ilya and Volodymyr, last call for any closing. I see. I do want to kind of convey to again, there was all told on Facebook and on Zoom, there was about 500 people that joined us today. And I think that this event was really such an urgent and important part of making sure that we have spaces to assess this and understand the moment and to build resistance and solidarity. And in that spirit, I just want to again repeat the endorsing organizations that were joined us today against the current anti-capitalist resistance: Haymarket Books, Internationalism from Below, Madison Area DSA, Merck 21 US, Midnight Sun, New Politics, Rampant Solidarity, and Spectre. It's now more important than ever that we begin to continue to carve out spaces to have out these debates and discussions. And as the chat so clearly showed, there is much to debate and to hammer out. So I think on that note, I'm gonna close again. My name is Lee. I'm from Tempest. We're the hosts, and we thank all of you, the panelists, so much, and also to all of you, the audience. Please stay in touch with us, stay in touch with each other, so we can find our way through this crisis and build a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Solidarity, everyone.